Tadej Troha. Tadej is researcher at the Institute of Philosophy and the head of the Institute of Philosophy. He works at the intersection of psychoanalysis, literature, film, and philosophy. Besides publishing numerous articles and book chapters on these very same topics, he is the author of two monographs in Slovene. The first one, Neither Miracle Nor Miracle, and the second one, Interventions into the Irreversible. Did I recall it right? And today's talk has the title Rat Man and the Chamber Pot. So today the floor is yours.
Okay, first I'd like to congratulate Arthur. It was a great presentation. Yeah, I feel kind of, well, not very happy, but I'm happy for you, but not for myself. Okay, so, well, to be perfectly honest, let me say, perversion is not really my strong suit, not my forte, at least not in theory, but who will know. A few years ago, however, I translated two texts into Slovenian and two case histories, to be exact, which are both full of fascinating scenes and fantasies of an undeniably perverse nature, whatever this means. The first one is a text by the most notorious, I would say, Freudian renegade, Wilhelm Stekel. This text is a part of a massive volume on sadism and masochism. It's got like 800 pages, very, very extensive. And this paper is entitled, The Hand is Being Beaten. This case study deals with a sadomasochistic paraphiliac, as Stekel puts it, who was, and this is a direct quote, in love with his own hand. The second text, however, is the original record of the Ratman case, the Freudian text, of course, an unedited record of the Ratman analysis preserved by a more or less symptomatic coincidence in Freud's estate. As is well known, Freud had the strict habit of burning all the raw material of his case studies after a while, after a week or maybe a month or maybe even a year or after many years, with this one single exception, the Ratman case. Okay, it would certainly, I'm sure, it would certainly be more fun to talk about Stekel's case. And it would also fit better with the topic of this conference, as much as Stekel would frown on the fact that we are still using the wrong term and talking about perversion instead of paraphilia. Given that, for several reasons, there is no long-form account of a perverse individual in Freud, except for the one that you mentioned, Arthur, it would also be kind of interesting to turn to an author who was the only one actually kicked out of the Freudian circle, and who set about filling the gap Freud left behind in the field of perversion with great vigor. Nevertheless, Stekel's case study is simply too extensive to be squeezed into this short time frame, especially since there is nothing in it that would help us kind of bridge the concreteness of the material and the potentially universal value of its results. So he gives us no assistance, no theoretical help or something like that. Stekel actually relies on the extensiveness of the case records always, in which theory as such is virtually absent, and which, even in the few places where it does appear, seems like a redundant, unproductive foreign body, actually, more trivial than any random sentence his patients produce. To go on, in a text entitled Towards a History of the Analytic Movement, another work in which he symbolically underscored his departure from Freud by an almost word-for-word imitation of the title of an earlier Freudian text, he wrote the following, I quote, "Freud is the ingenious theorist. I am more practical. Freud is the metapsychological philosopher. I am a realistic observer. I construct my compelling conclusions from clinical cases." And a few pages later in the same text, "I have never been so arrogant as to claim that I am of the same intellectual stature as Freud. I have used the comparison that a dwarf standing on the shoulders of a giant can see further than the giant. That would diminish my claim somewhat. And after a couple of sentences, he also adds, I flatter myself, Stekel namely, with the idea that I am the only true Freudian. I now represent Freud much better than he does himself. Okay, the reason why in a choice between Stekel and Freud, I will pick Freud, of course, is quite simple. As the original record of the Redman case shows with great clarity, Freud, on his part, also knew how to be more Stekel than Stekel, how to be the only true Stekelian, so to say. Freud also built his metapsychology as a realistic observer in some sense and based his conclusions on clinical cases. At the same time, he knew how to go one step further in his case presentations. He transformed the case study into a synthesis of practice and theory. What then is the value of having at our disposal the original record? What is the value of the residue that remains after the process of synthesis? And how does this relate to the title of my short paper? How does this relate to the chamber pot? Let us return to the central anecdote, the reason we are given the opportunity to read the original record in the first place. Again, Freud seems to have forgotten to destroy his notes only in the case of the rat man. This one case which Lacan later aptly assessed as having its main interest precisely in its extreme particularity. I quote Lacan. As always, he says, Freud emphasized that each case should be studied in its particularity, exactly if we were completely ignorant of theory. And what constitutes the particularity of this case is the manifest, visible character of the relationships involved. The particular value of this case as a model derives from its simplicity. In the same way, one may speak of a particular example in geometry as having a dazzlingly superior clarity when compared with a demonstration where, by reason of its discursive character, the truth remains veiled in the shadows of a long sequence of deductions. End of quote. So, although it may be tempting to label Freud's forgetting, his forgetting to burn the remains of this case, it may be tempting to label Freud's forgetting symptomatic and attribute to it an all too human, so to speak, character of countertransference, in which his barely concealed sympathy for the patient manifested itself. I would say that looking for a structural reason is probably more productive. Despite the inner simplicity organized by the great obsessive fear and the rat as an inner knot, the case is marked by the complexity of particularity as such, I would say. A case that can only be studied in the suspension of theory, as if we were completely ignorant of theory, can only be one case or such case whose particularity itself evades the concurrent state of theory. In other words, only a case that has the potential to manifest something that cannot be subsumed into theoretical templates has the power to suspend theory in the first place. So it's not a decision, it's more like it's not a decision to suspend a theory or to think as if no theory existed, but this is something that the material kind of forces the analyst or the theorist to do. And in this respect, one of the reasons for Freud's forgetting is probably very is probably very simple. Faced with an exceptionally particular case, Freud was probably made aware of the possibility of a different conceptualization of the unconscious, which he had not yet been able to formulate fully at the time of writing the published study. And perhaps he wanted to preserve this material and only postpone its destruction. Thus, at the very end of the case history, in a tellingly casual way, he brings in an observation that we could easily imagine as one of the cornerstones of the study, maybe even a separate study, but which remained at the level of an afterthought. I quote Freud here. I cannot take leave of my patient without putting on paper my impression that he had, as it were, disintegrated into three personalities. into one unconscious personality, that is to say, and into two preconscious ones between which his consciousness could oscillate. His unconscious comprised those of his impulses which had been suppressed at an early age and which might be described as passionate and evil impulses. In his normal state, he was kind, cheerful, and sensible, an enlightened and superior kind of person, while in his third psychological organization, he paid homage to superstition and asceticism. Thus, he was able to have two different creeds and two different outlooks upon life. End of quote. This metapsychological observation, or this metapsychological view alone, the existence of three nor two personalities, none of which attains the status of consciousness, breaks with any lay conception of the unconscious. All the more so because in this account we can discern, in addition to the unconscious personality, an alternative conception of the unconscious, that which manifests itself merely as an oscillation of consciousness itself, as drifting from one to another of the two preconscious personalities. Obviously, no further theoretical derivations of this observation can be found in the original record. What we are given, though, is the elementary form of a sudden theoretical insight. So this idea in an even more elementary form. In contrast to the published study, the patient's three personalities are presented here as much more equal, much more balanced, and much more intertwined. I quote again, "He is made up of three personalities, one humorous and normal, another ascetic and religious, and the third immoral and perverse." Inevitable misunderstanding of the unconscious by the conscious, or rather distortion of the shape of the unconscious wish. The hybrid thoughts resulting from these, end of quote. In the published case history, of course, we will also encounter some spectacular perverse fantasies, including, for example, a dream in which Freud's daughter appears with two patches of dung, of shit, of course, instead of her eyes. Likewise, in the published version, which in the first part reproduces almost verbatim the account of the first 7 sessions, we get a clear idea of the by no means innocent history of Ratman's childhood sexuality. Nevertheless, compared to the original record, one cannot help feeling that the published version is relatively aseptic, sterilized, and somewhat schematic, maybe even dehumanized. This feature of the published version, reinforced by the subsequent Lacanian reception, I would say, is understandable. If Freud, in his fidelity to the patient's singularity, had emphasized his signifying operations, the overly graphic accounts would probably have obscured the nodal role of the verbal bridge raten, raten, raten as rats, raten as installments, and then heiraten to marry, and spielrate, the gambler, through which the rat man succeeded in fusing sexuality and money in all these different forms. I quote again Freud, just from the original record. There is one extra point that he makes here. When at our first interview I told him my fees, he said to himself, "For each krone, a rat for the children." Now, raten, rats, really means to him raten, installments. He pronounced the words alike. He didn't say raten and raten, but he pronounced the words just the same as raten. And he justified this by saying that the A in ratum, from reor, is short. And he was once corrected by a lawyer who pointed out that raten and raten are not the same. Okay, this is just so he was he knew how to explain his bridge, in some sense. So it is essential to point out. Let me make this clear. The patient's most vivid fantasies, which have been omitted from the publication, from the published version, are not the suppressed scene of this case. I would not say that this is something like the real core or something like that. Indeed, anyone who has managed to digest the lessons of the published version will quickly realize that the new material that we get from reading the original record only reinforces the central role of the rat idea. The basic simplicity of the case Lacan spoke of remains, except that a broader range, I would say, of elements and characters are brought into play. Some are mere extras, others are essential to his early development. Let me just quote some of the most, revealing passages. The first one. He interrupted the analysis of the dream to tell me some transferences. A number of children were lying on the ground, and he went up to each of them and did something into their mouths. One of them, my son, that is his brother who had eaten excrement when he was 2 years old, still had brown marks around his mouth and was licking his lips as though it was something very nice. A change followed. It was I, Freud, and I was doing it to my mother. This reminded him of a fantasy in which he thought that a badly behaved female cousin of his was not even worthy that Giza should do her business into her mouth, and the picture had then been reversed. Pride and high regard lay behind this. A further recollection that his father was very coarse and liked using words like ass and shit, at which his mother always showed signs of being horrified. He once tried to imitate his father, and this involved him in a crime which went unpunished. He was a dirty pig, so once, when he was 11, his mother decided to give him a thorough good wash. He wept for shame and said, "Where are you going to scrub me next? On the arse?" This would have brought down the most severe chastisements of him from his father if his mother had not saved him. So there's another episode. A naked female bottom with nits, larvae of lice in the hair. Source, a scene with his sister Julie, which he had forgotten in his confession to me. And another. My mother's body naked. 2 swords. My mother, this is Freud's mother. Freud's body naked. Freud's mother's body naked. 2 swords sticking into her breasts from the side, like a decoration, he said later, following the Lucrece motif. The lower part of her body, and especially her genitals, had been entirely eaten up by me and the children. And again, he had a picture of one of the deputy judges, a dirty fellow. He imagined him naked, and the woman was practicing minette with him. Again, my daughter, Freud says. The dirty fellow was himself. He hoped soon to become a deputy judge himself, so as to be able to marry. He had heard of minette with honor, He had heard of minette with horror, but once when he was with the girl in Trieste, he pulled himself so far up that it was an invitation for her to do it to him. But this did not happen. I repeated my lecture of last Saturday of the perversions. And the last one, a most wonderful anal fantasy. He was lying on his back on a girl, my daughter, and was copulating with her by means of the stool hanging from his anus. So kind of copulating with Mr. Hanky, turning into something else. So this pointed directly to Julie, to whom he said, "Nothing about you would be disgusting to me." Okay. In this, I would say, generally fascinating images, the predominance of the anal-oral conjunction, so pronounced in the compulsive idea of the rat punishment, is most evident. And if, in keeping with the patient's sensitivity to the signifier, the fantasy of the feminette performed by the woman on her fellow judge is understood in the usual sense, or in the common sense, that is as cunnilingus, rather than simply fellatio, as the Minette is interpreted by the editors of the Gesamte Werke, it becomes pretty plausible that the red man's sexuality is a touch more polymorphous and convoluted than we might like to believe. So if faire Minette is what it usually means in French, so to eat pussy, then this idea of a woman eating pussy of his male judge colleague is, at least in the signifying, at the signifier, the level of the signifier is a bit strange. And when I said earlier, okay, that the original notes expand the scope of the case, they also undermine the notion of a broad, airy setting that the published study suggests. They compress, as it were, the space in which the red man moves. For instance, we find out that the idealized lady was none other than his cousin. The published analysis also almost completely ignores the crucial role of his two sisters in the formation of his sexuality, which is presented there in great detail. His older sister Katerina introduced into his personal history the experience of death, which became both dominant and adamantly disavowed when it returned with his father's death. And given that his earliest memories are also linked to her death, one passage in which the memory takes an additional step back proves highly significant. Okay, we all remember the story told to him by the cruel captain of an especially horrible punishment used in the East, which triggered the outbreak of his illness, or his final outbreak. The criminal was tied up, a pot was turned upside down on his buttocks, some rats were put into it, and they bored their way into his anus. Lacan points out that the scene with the rats does not precipitate his neurosis, but rather actualizes its motives. Above all, we should add, this scene actualizes the prehistory of his illness. It actualizes what could never be actualized. The origin of the pot was a very particular chamber pot. And here's the one final, the one quote from the, not really the final quote, but the second to last quote from the original records. I told him I suspected that his sexual curiosity had been kindled in relation to his sisters. This had an immediate result. He had a memory that he first noticed the difference between the sexes when he saw his deceased sister Katerina, 5 years his senior, sitting on the pot or something of the sort. So sitting on the chamber pot, of course. End of quote. If we allow ourselves a little speculation and consider this scene as the primal scene of this case, we can conclude with the following construction. When little Ernst Lanza first notices the sexual difference, when he is confronted for the first time with the sight of the leg, the riddle is immediately displaced and substituted by another kind of riddle. There is nothing to see here, but what is really interesting is another question. What is happening on the other side, on the back side? What is happening in the empty space of the pot that I cannot physically see and that remains sealed as long as someone sits on it? Sometimes I see worms there, signaling that the excrement has a life of its own and is capable of resurrection, so to say. And there is a one final quote. Once, when he was 10, he saw his boy cousin defecating, and the latter showed him a big worm in his stool. He was very much disgusted. With this, he associated what he described as the greatest fright of his life. When he was rather less than 6, his mother had a stuffed bird from a hat, which he borrowed to play with. As he was running along with it in his hands, its wings moved. He was terrified that it had come to life again and threw it down. I thought of the connection with his sister's death. This scene suddenly took place later, and I pointed out how his having thought this about the bird made it easier for him to believe afterwards in his father's resurrection. So let me conclude. In that pot, in that chamber pot, in that closed space that defies death, his unconscious personality simmered, so to speak, fueling his compulsion and his reactionary formations, making him severely incapacitated for work. This would perhaps remain so forever if a proper sadistic subject had not appeared and articulated the possibility of this undead substance bearing its way back to where it came from. This experience, to quote Redman, was the immediate occasion of his coming to Freud. Thank you.
Thank you, Tadej, very much for this really wonderful talk. Q&A section for remarks, comments, questions. Who would go first?
Thank you very much. Today, I just have one very simple, probably too simple, naive question. Is it what you just said at the end? Could you say that the emergence of this properly sadist person, the truly sadist person that prompt him to analysis, is a kind of moment of hysterization?
Yeah.
Or something?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't, so it's kind of, the fact that he was able to be hysterized by a sadist actually attached to the fact, to his obsessional neurosis, of course, of his constellation. But yeah, of course, yeah. The idea was that he needed this extra, he always had this, he couldn't bring all these ideas that were kind of, as I put it, that have simmered in this chamber pot, right? So his unconscious personality was never been able to make an additional step. So it would kind of, there was, so to go a step further, it was like in a pressure cooker, I would say, right? So his unconscious, this formation of his perverse fantasies was always like, only came up to a certain level and was kept within, and it would kind of perpetuate forever, right? So this episode was the one that really brought him to face it.